He paraded his blonde mistress, until his wife showed up and shut everything down. Early evening settled over uptown Charlotte, in that familiar way the city knows how to do. Warm lights glowing through glass, the hum of conversations rising and falling, soft jazz drifting in from hidden speakers. The restaurant sat at the corner of a polished block, the type of place where the waitstaff carried themselves with quiet confidence, and every guest pretended life was smooth, effortless, controlled. Inside, silverware touched plates with a gentle ring. Outside, Tiana stood at the entrance, one hand resting on the doorframe, like she needed that single point of contact to remember she was still here. She didn't look upset. She didn't look confused. She looked still. A stillness that came from months of being patient, months of hoping, months of hurting quietly so she wouldn't disturb anything. Her breath stayed steady. Her shoulders didn't tremble. No tears, no hurried blinking. Just a calm that felt too calm. The kind of calm a person reaches when the truth is no longer fighting to stay hidden. From where she stood, she could see straight through the glass wall. Nicholas leaned slightly toward the blonde woman beside him, laughing, open, unguarded. It wasn't the laugh itself that struck Tiana. It was the way it sounded, like he had set a weight down, like he had found ease in someone who required nothing from him. It was a sound she hadn't heard from him in months. Once, that laughter belonged to late-night jokes and quiet mornings between them. Now it was being offered to someone who had never carried any part of their history. A waiter walked past Tiana, pausing just long enough to tilt his head politely. "Ma'am, are you meeting someone inside?" She didn't respond, didn't shift. Her eyes stayed on Nicholas's hand, resting a little too comfortably on the back of the blonde woman's chair. And right there, something loosened inside her. Not in anger, not in heartbreak, something far simpler and far heavier. Acceptance. That moment when your heart finally stops arguing with reality. If you've ever had that moment, when love stops hurting and starts telling the truth, go ahead and like this video so YouTube can share it with more people who might need it. Inside, Nicholas turned casually at first, then stopped. His entire expression fell apart in an instant. The blonde woman straightened, uncertain. A soft gasp came from a nearby table, followed by a sharp hush that moved through the room like a sudden wind. Tiana stepped forward, slow, steady, unshaken, not to confront, not to create a scene, but because she was done standing in doorways. The restaurant seemed to shrink around them. Even the jazz music felt distant now, fading behind the pressure that settled on everyone's shoulders as Nicholas stood frozen, unable to hide. Tiana paused, letting the moment breathe before she whispered, quiet enough for only herself, but heavy enough to echo through everything that would follow. "So this is the man he chose to become." And with that, the real story began. Welcome to Mr. Graham's Stories, where real stories meet real-life lessons. Every video here is crafted to inspire, challenge, and stay with you long after it ends. If you believe in growth, second chances, and meaningful storytelling, you're home. Subscribe, like the video, and tell us the time and where you're watching from. Charlotte has always been a city of contrasts. Not the dramatic kind people use for effect, the quiet kind you only notice when you've lived there long enough to understand its rhythm. On one side of the city, you have neighborhoods filled with long porches, folding chairs, music drifting out of someone's open window, and families who know each other so well they don't bother with formal greetings. Life moves with warmth there. People speak with their eyes before their mouths catch up. You can walk down a street and smell someone frying chicken, hear old-school R&B playing through a cracked screen door, and know instantly you're in a place built on community. That's the world Tiana came from. Southside Charlotte. Lively, layered, familiar. A place that teaches you how to read the room before you ever take a seat in it. Tiana grew up surrounded by voices. Her mother humming gospel while cooking on Saturday mornings. Her uncles debating sports loudly enough for the neighbors to chime in. Her cousins racing through the house like every hallway was a track meet. Laughter lived in those walls. So did truth. Her mother had a saying she repeated so often it stitched itself into Tiana's thinking. "Baby, a person's character always shows up before their intentions do." It was the kind of line you don't fully appreciate until you step into rooms that challenge who you are. And for Tiana, that line would matter more than she ever expected. Growing up, she wasn't sheltered. She saw good days, hard years, people who struggled, people who made it out, people who lost themselves along the way. But what she never lacked was emotional grounding. Her family didn't hide their feelings. They processed them together. They confronted problems head-on. They believed avoiding discomfort was how small issues turned into storms. So Tiana learned early how to communicate, how to listen, and how to tell when someone was saying one thing but feeling another. It made her thoughtful. It made her perceptive. It made her strong in quiet ways. By the time she reached adulthood, she carried herself with a calm confidence. Not loud, not performative, just rooted. She knew where she came from, and that was enough. Nicholas, meanwhile, had a completely different upbringing. Uptown Charlotte was practically designed for people like him, people who grew up in homes where everything had a place, where emotions were tidied away like seasonal decorations, where reputation mattered more than honesty. He was raised in a world of polished dinner tables, scheduled vacations, networking events masquerading as family gatherings, and expectations steep enough to make a person forget what they actually wanted. His parents loved him in the way people do when love is tied to achievement, supportive, present, but quietly conditional. If he excelled, they smiled. If he failed, they changed the subject. Not cruel, not unkind, just surface level. Nicholas learned early how to keep things smooth, how to avoid conflict, how to dress the part, how to say the right thing without meaning half of it. He didn't break rules in dramatic ways. He simply drifted around them with a confidence that came from never being told no with any real consequence. He wasn't taught emotional strength. He was taught emotional avoidance. Feelings were inconvenient. Hard conversations were unnecessary. Discomfort was something you walked around, not through. So while Tiana grew up learning how to stay present in the truth of things, Nicholas grew up learning how to slip away from it. 2 different neighborhoods, 2 different families, 2 different emotional languages. But here's the thing about people shaped by opposite worlds. Their blind spots often run parallel. Tiana's blind spot? She believed she could soothe any gap with understanding, patience, or clarity. She didn't realize some people aren't lacking warmth. They're lacking the ability to stand still long enough to feel it. Nicholas's blind spot. He assumed anyone who cared for him would simply absorb his flaws, smooth his edges, and remain steady, no matter how absent or distracted he became. Both carried unspoken expectations. Both had emotional habits shaped long before they ever met. Both were walking into something beautiful and fragile. Charlotte made room for both of them, but in very different ways. On Tiana's side of the city, she learned to open her heart with intention. On Nicholas's side, he learned to protect his comfort above all else. Neither was wrong on their own, but together, they were 2 worlds that weren't built to merge smoothly. They could complement each other, yes, in the beginning, but they could also collide in ways neither of them had the experience to recognize early enough. And that collision didn't begin the night Tiana walked into that restaurant. It began years before, in the way they were raised, in the way they loved, in the way they understood responsibility, and in the way they filled the spaces between them with assumptions instead of truth. Before their story became heartbreak, it was already a meeting of 2 emotional histories moving toward each other with impossible hope. Uptown Charlotte has its own kind of pulse during the work week, not frantic, just steady. A mix of ambition, caffeine, and the quiet hum of people trying to build the lives they whispered about in college dorms and shared apartments. Tiana walked into one of those modern co-working buildings on a bright Tuesday morning, carrying her laptop bag, a notebook filled with brainstorming sketches, and the kind of focus that comes when you're preparing for a client pitch you want to get just right. The building itself was stylish but practical. Long hallways of glass offices, leafy plants placed with deliberate care, printers humming in the background, people pacing with phones to their ears. The conference rooms were usually booked out weeks in advance, which is why she'd secured one early. At least, she thought she had. She opened the door and stopped. Someone was already inside. Nicholas was seated at the table, typing with an intensity that suggested he was trying to outrun a deadline or a problem he didn't want to admit was real. His posture was straight, his eyes fixed on the screen, and his fingers moved so fast it almost looked like he was challenging the keyboard to keep up. Tiana hesitated for a second, then cleared her throat. Not loudly, just enough to announce her presence. He didn't look up. She tried again, gentler this time. "Hey, I think we might be double booked." That got his attention. He glanced up quickly, annoyance flickering across his face, the kind of automatic reaction people have when their momentum is interrupted. But the moment his eyes landed on her, something in him softened, almost like his frustration had been replaced by curiosity. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, blinking as if recalibrating. "I booked this room for an hour. Maybe there was a mistake." Tiana lifted her phone to check the email confirmation. No, you're right. I booked it too. Looks like the system overlapped us. Most people would have insisted on staying, or leaving abruptly, or negotiating awkwardly, but her voice stayed steady. Well, the room is big enough. We can share if you don't mind. Nicholas paused. That wasn't the answer he expected. He straightened his shoulders, trying to regain that polished composure he wore like a uniform. Are you sure? He asked. I don't want to interfere with your meeting. Tiana shrugged slightly. As long as you don't type like you're fighting your laptop, I think we'll be okay. He let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close. It was the first crack in his guarded manner. They settled on opposite ends of the table, doing their best to focus on their work. For a few minutes, the only sound was typing, the faint buzz of conversation from outside the glass walls, and the soft clink of Tiana's pen tapping lightly against her notebook as she outlined her presentation. She wasn't trying to watch him, but every now and then she caught him observing her, not in a way that felt uncomfortable, but in a way that suggested he didn't quite know how to process her calm confidence. Finally, he broke the silence. What's your project? He asked, leaning back in his chair. Tiana didn't look up immediately. She finished writing a bullet point, then glanced over with an easy expression. Marketing refresh for a small business. They're trying to figure out their identity. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. That's actually interesting. What do you normally focus on? People. She answered simply. You can't fix a brand until you understand the people behind it. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing more than just her words. I work in consulting, he said. Mostly finance and strategic planning. She smiled lightly. I could tell. He blinked. How? You walked in here like you're carrying a clock inside your head, she said. Like you're always counting something. Nicholas stared at her for a second, thrown off balance. Most people in his world complimented him, or tried to impress him. No one ever saw through him that quickly. He let out a quiet exhale. That obvious, huh? Only if you know what you're looking at. There it was, the first real connection. Not romantic, not charged, not cinematic, just human. They continued talking in small pockets of time. Not enough to distract from work, but enough to chip away at the invisible wall Nicholas carried everywhere. He asked about her client pitch, genuinely curious. She asked about his project, genuinely listening. Their conversation was easy, natural, unaffected. No scripted lines, no forced charm. Just two people sharing a room and, for reasons neither fully understood yet, choosing to let their guard down in ways that felt safe. At one point, Nicholas watched her jot down notes, her expression thoughtful, her posture relaxed, and he realized something startling. She wasn't impressed by him. Not by his clothes, not by his expensive watch, not by the way people usually reacted when they learned about his family background. She looked at him like she was trying to understand the person, not the resume, and that unsettled him more than he expected. People in his world always reacted to the packaging first. Tiana didn't. There was a moment, a quiet one, when she asked a question he didn't have a polished answer for. Do you actually enjoy the work you do, or are you just good at it? Nicholas froze. He thought she was asking casually. She wasn't. Her eyes held a softness that suggested she was willing to hear whatever truth he offered, even if it wasn't pretty. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. No one had ever asked him that in a way that required honesty. Tiana lowered her gaze back to her notes, giving him room to think. It wasn't a test. She wasn't prying. She simply asked because it mattered. And that moment, that exact moment, was when something shifted. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't desire. It wasn't even interest in the romantic sense. It was recognition. Nicholas felt seen in a way that was unfamiliar. And Tiana, without trying, without angling, without charm, had offered him something he didn't know he needed, a space where he didn't have to perform. That was the beginning. Not dramatic, not loud, just honest. Two people in a borrowed conference room, sharing a morning that neither of them realized would shape the next years of their lives. The shared conference room could have been just another forgettable morning, one of those moments that pass through a week without leaving any mark. But something about that day held a different kind of energy, one neither Tiana nor Nicholas knew how to name yet. After their first conversation, the room felt less stiff. Nicholas typed with a little less tension in his shoulders. Tiana's notes flowed more easily, her thoughts settling into place. There was no pressure between them, just a comfortable, unexpectedly warm silence that comes when two people don't need to prove anything. When Tiana's client arrived, Nicholas politely gathered his things to give her space, but she waved him off. "It's fine," she said. "You're not in the way." Most people would have taken that as a courtesy. Nicholas took it as something else, an unusual softness he wasn't used to receiving without conditions. He stayed, tucked into a corner of the room while Tiana presented ideas to her client with ease and clarity. She spoke with confidence, drawing simple shapes on the whiteboard, explaining how emotions influence branding, how stories shape the way people connect to a business. Nicholas watched quietly, impressed in a way he didn't show. Her mind worked differently. He could see her insight in real time, see how she read people, how she instinctively understood the layers beneath their words. When the meeting ended and the client left with a grateful smile, Tiana sat down with a tired sigh. "That went well?" Nicholas asked. "It went," she replied with a half smile. "They're good people, just unsure about what they want." He nodded. "Most companies are. They think they want numbers, but what they really want is direction." Tiana glanced at him, surprised by the accuracy of that comment. "You get it more than I thought." Nicholas shrugged, almost self-conscious. "You'd be surprised what I pay attention to." That was the first moment their conversations drifted beyond work. Over the next few weeks they crossed paths again, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes because one of them adjusted their schedule slightly, though neither admitted it. The building's coffee station became familiar territory. The shared tables in the lounge felt a little less impersonal. It started small. A shared laugh about something they overheard. A quiet moment when they both reached for the same sugar packet. A soft apology that turned into a brief conversation. None of it loud. None of it planned. But every encounter stitched them closer together. One night, Tiana stayed late to finish a project. The building was almost empty. Lights dimmed. The hum of the air conditioning the only sound. She was scribbling on a piece of paper, trying to rework a tagline when she heard footsteps. Nicholas appeared at the door, jacket in hand, looking more tired than usual. "You're still here?" he asked gently. "So are you," she replied. He offered a small smile, then leaned against the doorframe. "Can't seem to get some numbers to line up. Thought staying late might scare them into cooperating." Tiana chuckled softly. "You know they won't." "I know," he admitted. But it sounded better than going home to stare at the ceiling. There was an honesty in that sentence, a quiet admission he didn't typically share with anyone. Tiana gestured toward the empty chair beside her. "Sit. You look like you need a moment." Nicholas hesitated, then took the seat. They didn't jump into deep conversation. There was no dramatic confession or sudden spark. Just two people sitting in the soft glow of a nearly empty office, both carrying the weight of long days, both relieved to find someone who offered presence without demand. Tiana eventually pushed a container toward him. "Want some?" "I packed dinner but ended up not eating." Nicholas blinked in surprise. "You're offering me your food?" "Trust me, I'm not starving. And I made too much." He lifted the lid and was greeted with pasta that smelled like something a person cooks with care, not speed. "Thank you," he said quietly. They ate together, talking about work in little pieces, drifting into conversations about music, the shows they grew up watching, the things they used to dream about. Nicholas shared a story about getting lost during a family trip to Asheville when he was 8. Tiana laughed, shaking her head. "You, lost? You seem like you were born with a map in your hand." "Not at all," he said, chuckling. "My parents looked more embarrassed than worried." Tiana raised an eyebrow. "That sounds incredibly on brand for your upbringing." He paused, studying her expression. "You see a lot. I pay attention," she corrected gently. He let that sit. Connection rarely starts with fireworks. Sometimes it starts with pasta in a quiet office. Sometimes it starts with someone noticing you more deeply than you're used to. Nicholas found himself looking for her without meaning to, checking if she was in the lounge when he grabbed coffee, glancing toward the lobby when he walked into the building. He didn't chase the feeling, he simply let it exist. For Tiana, the shift was slower. She liked him, not romantically at first, but as someone who carried more depth than he let the world see. She noticed how he listened when she spoke, how he softened around her without realizing it, how the stiffness he usually wore eased the more they interacted. Late-night brainstorming sessions started happening more often. They'd sit across from each other in the quiet conference rooms, taking breaks to tease each other about work habits. "You're too structured," she'd say. "And you're too intuitive," he'd counter. "Maybe that's why we work well in this space," she'd suggest. He'd glance at her for a heartbeat too long before looking away. There were evenings when she caught him watching her while she scribbled ideas, his gaze thoughtful, almost tender, the kind of look he didn't even realize he was giving. Those glances told the truth before either of them spoke it. The attraction didn't feel rushed. It didn't feel sudden. It unfolded gently, like something waking up. But beneath that growing warmth lay the first shadow of future conflict, the part Nicholas didn't know how to confront. He liked her. He admired her. He was drawn to her depth. But vulnerability, opening himself emotionally, letting someone see past the polished exterior, that wasn't natural for him. And in these soft early moments, even as connection grew, Nicholas already showed the signs of someone who wanted closeness but feared being fully known. Tiana didn't see it yet, not clearly, but it was there, a quiet warning that loving him would require more patience than she realized. For now, though, all she knew was simple. Something real was beginning, quietly, gently, beautiful in its softness, the kind of beginning that feels safe, until it isn't. The early days of Tiana and Nicholas's connection felt simple: quiet conversations, shared dinners in empty conference rooms, small smiles exchanged across tables. But once they moved beyond the co-working space and started blending their worlds, the real differences became impossible to ignore. The first time Nicholas invited Tiana to a social event with his colleagues, she wasn't nervous. Tiana wasn't someone who shrank in new spaces. She grew up in rooms filled with every kind of personality. She knew how to read energy, how to adjust without losing herself, how to hold composure even when the environment felt foreign. What she didn't expect was the subtle tension waiting beneath the polished surface. The event was held at one of those rooftop lounges in uptown Charlotte. Sleek floors, dim lighting, and people dressed neatly enough to suggest they'd planned their outfits 2 days ahead. Music floated softly in the background, and the skyline glowed like it was performing for them. Nicholas held her hand as they walked in. It should have felt grounding. Instead, it felt like something he was doing to convince himself everything was fine. A few of his colleagues noticed them first. They smiled, wide, polite, almost too carefully arranged. "Nick, you made it," one of them said, before turning to Tiana with a gesture that felt practiced. "And you must be—" "Tiana," she replied warmly. "Nice to meet you." The man nodded a little too quickly. "Of course. Welcome." It wasn't rude. It wasn't openly dismissive. It was something in between, a hesitation, a flicker in the eyes that spoke more than the words did. Another colleague approached, offering a handshake that felt limp, followed by a comment she had heard in different forms before. "Wow, you're not what I pictured." Tiana didn't flinch, but her mind caught it immediately. Not what I pictured. Not what fits into his world. Not what makes sense to people who assume they already know Nicholas. She simply smiled and said, "I get that a lot," letting the comment fall flat instead of absorbing it. Nicholas didn't respond. He didn't defend her. He didn't correct the tone. He just chuckled nervously and guided her toward the bar as if moving would erase what happened. But movement doesn't erase truth. As the evening went on, the interactions followed the same pattern: polite smiles, faint curiosity, questions that sounded friendly but carried a subtle edge. "So, how did you two meet? What kind of work do you do again?" "Oh, interesting. That's very different from what Nick is used to." Every comment was wrapped in courtesy, but the message underneath was clear. "You don't belong here. You are an exception. You are unexpected." Tiana kept her posture steady. She kept her voice even. She kept her smile warm. But she felt the weight of being examined, measured even, by people who didn't know her story, didn't know her heart, and didn't know how much she brought to Nicholas's life. And Nicholas. He stayed silent through it all. Not once did he say, "She's incredible. She's the person who challenges me in ways I needed. She's not here to fit in. She's here because she matters to me." He stood by her side like someone trying to minimize friction rather than stand in truth. At one point, a woman wearing a pearl necklace approached them. She smiled politely, leaned in, and said to Nicholas, "Your guest has such a calm presence, very grounded. That must feel refreshing for you." The word guest struck harder than anything else that evening. Tiana wasn't his guest. She wasn't a visitor. She wasn't someone he brought along for novelty. But Nicholas didn't correct it. He didn't say her name. He didn't reframe the narrative. He simply nodded. Tiana felt something inside her shift, not drastically, not painfully, but with the quiet weight of realizing she was carrying the burden of fitting into his world alone. Later, when they stepped outside for air, she leaned against the railing, looking out at the lights stretching across Charlotte. Nicholas stood beside her, hands in his pockets, as if unsure how to bridge the silence. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I'm fine," she said, and she meant it, emotionally steady but aware. He nodded as if relieved, not realizing she wasn't reassuring him. She was observing him. "Your colleagues seem interesting," she added. Nicholas laughed lightly. "They can be a lot." "You handled them well." Tiana turned to him. "Handled them?" He blinked, unsure why the phrase mattered. She didn't press. She wasn't trying to start a conflict. She just wanted to understand him better, and understand how he saw her place in his world. "You didn't say much tonight," she finally said. Nicholas shrugged. "I didn't want to make things awkward." Her eyes softened, not with hurt, but with the clarity of someone seeing patterns form. "So you stayed quiet." He misread her tone. "I thought staying out of the way was better." Tiana looked back over the city again. "It would have been nice to know you had my back." Nicholas's jaw tensed, not in anger but in discomfort. He wasn't used to hearing truth spoken so calmly. "I didn't think you needed help," he said. "I didn't," Tiana replied gently. "But you did." He looked confused, then unsettled. Because she wasn't asking him to shield her, she was asking him to show that he saw her. They stood there for a while, letting the quiet talk for them. Tiana wasn't upset. She wasn't wounded. She didn't feel less than, but she internalized something important. Nicholas didn't know how to stand between her and the world he came from, not out of malice, but out of habit. And habits, when left unchecked, become patterns. Patterns become distance. Distance becomes the first crack in a foundation that should have been stronger. As they left the rooftop that night, Tiana walked beside him without holding his arm. Not cold, not distant, just thinking. Nicholas didn't notice the change, another sign of how far his upbringing trained him to overlook emotional shifts. And that was the beginning, not of the end, not yet, but of the quiet divide that would grow between them long before betrayal ever arrived. The night on the rooftop didn't end in an argument. No slammed doors, no raised voices, just a quiet ride back to Tiana's place in Charlotte, with both of them staring out separate windows, thinking two different thoughts neither of them spoke aloud. Tiana kept replaying the moments that mattered, the awkward smiles, the subtle comments, the way Nicholas stayed silent each time someone spoke to her like she was an unfamiliar addition to his life. She wasn't hurt in the dramatic sense. It wasn't heartbreak. It was disappointment settling in slow, steady layers. Nicholas, on the other hand, viewed the evening through a different lens. He thought everything had gone fine. Sure, some moments were uncomfortable, but he had grown up brushing discomfort aside before it could attach itself to anything real. To him, ignoring tension was the quickest way to keep the peace. They went to bed without addressing what lingered in the air, and that silence became the blueprint for the months that followed. Work began swallowing more of Nicholas's time. He started coming home later, not suspiciously late, not dramatically late, just late enough that the rhythm they once shared began slipping out of sync. At first, Tiana chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of life. People get busy. Projects pick up. Deadlines demand attention. She told herself not to overthink it. That's how relationships survive, by giving grace. But grace becomes heavy when only one person is carrying it. Nicholas would walk through the door with that tired but distracted expression he wore whenever stress clung to him. He'd kiss her cheek, mumble something about a long day, and disappear into his laptop or a quiet corner of the apartment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't distant in a cold way. He was simply somewhere else, mentally, emotionally, leaving only a fraction of himself behind for her to interact with. Tiana noticed the shift the same way someone notices the gradual dimming of a lamp. Not all at once, but undeniably. She started cooking dinner earlier, hoping he'd join. Then later, hoping he'd at least sit beside her while she ate. Most nights, they ended up eating separately, her at the table, him on the couch with his screen glowing against his face. She tried to keep things normal, asked how his day went, offered him tea at night, suggested weekend plans. His responses were polite, short, surface level, not hostile, just absent. One evening, Tiana approached him while he sat on the couch reviewing documents. "Nick," she said gently, "we haven't talked in days. Are you okay?" He didn't look up immediately. "Yeah, just tired." "That's not what I asked." His eyes finally met hers, tired, unfocused. I'm fine, T, really. He meant it in the way people say I'm fine when they haven't checked their own emotional temperature in weeks. Tiana nodded slowly, trying not to push. Okay, I'm here if you want to talk. Thanks, he said, already looking back at his laptop. It wasn't rejection. It was indifference. And indifference hurts in ways anger never could. The emotional distance began showing up in small, everyday moments. Nicholas stopped initiating conversations the way he used to. Stopped asking about her projects. Stopped offering those quiet glances he once gave her across rooms, the ones that said he saw her, even when he didn't speak. He didn't stop loving her, but he stopped showing it. Love doesn't disappear suddenly. It fades through 1,000 small pauses. One morning, Tiana cooked breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just eggs and toast, something she used to do whenever she sensed Nicholas was overwhelmed. He walked into the kitchen, gave a distracted morning, and reached straight for the coffee pot. "You're not eating?" she asked. He blinked at the plate like he hadn't noticed it. "Oh, I'm running late. You didn't even sit down," she said softly. "There's no time, T. I've got a meeting in 15 minutes. She watched him leave with a tight smile, holding back the heaviness settling in her chest. Once the door closed, she sat at the table, staring at the untouched plate meant for two. She didn't cry. She didn't spiral. She didn't assume the worst. But she felt the shift clearly. Affection had become an afterthought. Their first real argument came shortly after, not loud, not combative, but deeply wounding in its quiet delivery. It was a Friday evening. Tiana had planned something simple: pasta, candlelight, a chance for them to reconnect. Nothing dramatic, just a moment for them to be present with each other. Nicholas came home 40 minutes late, eyes glued to his phone as he stepped inside. Tiana looked up from the dinner table. "You're late." "Traffic," he murmured, barely glancing at her. She motioned toward the table. "I made dinner." He nodded and set his bag down. "Can we eat later? I just need to finish something." There it was, the blow that doesn't feel like a blow until it lands. Tiana breathed slowly. "Nick, I've been waiting. Just sit with me for a few minutes." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "T, please. It's been a long day. Can we not do this right now? Can we not do this?" The words stung not because of the tone, but because of what they implied, that her need for him was an inconvenience. She swallowed her disappointment. "You don't even see it, do you?" He finally looked at her, confused. "See what? That you've been gone even when you're in the room." Nicholas frowned. "You're reading too much into things." There it was again, the dismissal she feared, the one that made her feel like she had to justify the ache she carried alone. "I'm not," she said quietly. "I'm just trying to reach you." He sighed, the type of sigh people release when they feel cornered even when they're not. "T, I'm tired. Please, not tonight." The conversation ended right there, not with a resolution, not with understanding, just with exhaustion. Tiana extinguished the candles one by one. Nicholas closed himself in the study, and the silence that filled the apartment didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them knew how to confront. Love gets loud when it's new. It gets quiet when it's in trouble. What they didn't realize was that the quiet wasn't rest. It was warning. Months earlier, they had shared pasta in a dim office, laughing about random things and bonding over honesty neither expected. Now they sat in the same home, but miles apart, and neither knew how deep that distance would cut later. The weeks after their quiet argument carried a tone that neither of them addressed directly. Nothing exploded. Nothing shattered. But the feeling of ease that once lived between them had thinned out in ways that were hard to ignore. Nicholas began adjusting himself in small, noticeable ways, not dramatic changes, just subtle shifts that signaled his energy was drifting toward something he couldn't or wouldn't name. The first thing Tiana picked up on was the new cologne. She noticed it one morning as he bent down to grab his briefcase, the scent lingering a second longer than the bottle he usually kept on the bathroom counter. It wasn't a scent she'd ever smelled on him before. Cleaner, sharper, something he hadn't worn in all their time together. "New fragrance?" she asked casually. Nicholas blinked, then nodded with a tone that felt too dismissive for such a simple question. "Yeah, something I picked up. No explanation, no detail, just distance packaged as normalcy." Tiana didn't push. She simply made a mental note, not out of suspicion, but out of awareness. After that came the grooming changes. Nicholas started paying more attention to his appearance, not in a vain way, but in a way that didn't align with how he behaved when he was emotionally grounded. He fixed his hair with more care, adjusted his collars more frequently, and lingered in the mirror a bit longer than usual. None of this was inherently wrong, but when paired with emotional absence, small shifts become silent signals. Tiana didn't confront him. She didn't accuse him. She didn't let insecurity guide her. She simply observed, something she'd been trained to do all her life. The next sign was more subtle, the way he guarded his phone. Nicholas wasn't someone who hid his screen before. He used to leave his phone on the counter, face up, while cooking or relaxing. Now he angled it away without thinking, kept it in his pocket more often, checked it quietly with his back slightly turned. One night, while they sat on opposite sides of the couch, his phone vibrated. Nicholas picked it up immediately, typing quickly before placing it face down. Tiana raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he replied, eyes still on the screen. "Work message." It wasn't the message that bothered her. It was how instinctive his secrecy felt. Something inside her tightened, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she responded with a calm nod. "All right." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. Because the truth is, emotional distance doesn't begin with a dramatic moment. It begins with unspoken shifts, the ones both people pretend not to notice. As the days passed, Nicholas's silence grew louder than any argument they could have had. He came home late more often, always with a vague explanation. Busy day. Unexpected meeting. Just running behind. None of these were lies, necessarily, but none of them were the full truth either. Tiana watched him drift in and out of the apartment like someone appearing in two different worlds at once, the physical space they shared and a mental space she no longer had access to. She began to sense the emotional vacuum forming between them, not because she doubted him, but because her intuition, the same intuition that guided her work, her relationships, her life, was growing louder. One night, she decided to gently address the shift. "Nick," she said as he dropped his keys on the table, "are we okay?" He sighed. The same sigh she'd heard before, the one he used whenever he wanted to avoid a conversation rather than face it. "T, you're overthinking again." The words landed like a soft blow. Not harsh, not sharp, just diminishing. She crossed her arms lightly, holding her own disappointment without letting it spill. "I'm asking because I care. Not because I'm accusing you of anything." He shrugged, loosening his tie. "It's just work. Seriously. You don't need to read into everything." But she wasn't reading into anything. She was reading what was right in front of her. Tiana let it go for the moment, choosing peace over pressing an issue he clearly wasn't ready to confront. But silence doesn't soothe a wound, it just keeps it from being visible. Over time, the emotional gap grew into something tangible. Tiana noticed how conversations became shorter, how Nicholas stopped leaning into her presence the way he used to, how his laughter, once warm and unguarded in quiet spaces, now felt muted at home. She noticed how he stood a little farther away when they talked, how his hugs became brief, how his voice lost the softness it once carried around her. She noticed. She always noticed, but she kept hoping. Not hoping out of desperation, hoping out of love. One evening, she suggested they take a walk in their neighborhood, something they used to do during their early months together. Nicholas hesitated, glancing at his phone. "Maybe tomorrow," he murmured. "It's nice out tonight," she offered, but his eyes were already drifting away. "I'm exhausted, T. Rain check?" She gave a small nod, though she knew the rain check wouldn't come. Nicholas walked into the bedroom, leaving her by the doorway, standing in the glow of a lamp that suddenly felt too bright for such a lonely moment. The emotional drift didn't make noise. It didn't break glass. It didn't shout. It whispered. It whispered in the way Nicholas stopped noticing when she dressed up a little. It whispered in the way he missed small details she mentioned. It whispered in the way he answered questions with single syllables. It whispered in the way he seemed relieved when she didn't ask more. And Tiana's intuition, the same intuition she trusted with her work, her relationships, her life, began tightening in her chest. Not accusing, not jumping to conclusions, just aware. She wasn't losing her partner overnight. She was losing him through a slow-release detachment neither of them wanted to admit was happening. The danger wasn't another woman, not yet. The danger was the silence. Silence has weight. Silence has shape. Silence fills the spaces where love once lived. And in that silence, Tiana realized something painful. Nicholas wasn't choosing someone else. He simply wasn't choosing her. Not actively, not intentionally, just slowly, quietly, carelessly. The kind of carelessness that becomes the doorway to mistakes people swear they never saw coming. That was the beginning of the emotional drift. Before betrayal had a name. Before the blonde woman existed. Before the restaurant. Before the confrontation. This was where the real damage started. In the small moments Nicholas thought meant nothing, and in the quiet observations Tiana carried alone. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the sky had already changed. The shift didn't arrive with fireworks or confessions or anything loud enough to catch Tiana's attention at first. It entered quietly, almost politely, the way trouble often sneaks into a person's life when they aren't paying attention. And for Nicholas, it began with something as small and harmless as a compliment. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon at his office. Nicholas was standing near the break area, sleeves rolled up, glasses sliding down his nose as he reviewed numbers on a printed chart. He looked tired, not the physical kind, but the kind that sinks into your posture when you've been emotionally absent from home for so long you forget what presence is supposed to feel like. A coworker walked past, a woman he'd worked with for years. Nothing unusual about her, nothing intentional, nothing with weight. She glanced at him and said lightly, almost in passing, "New cologne? You smell good today." Nicholas didn't think anything of it at first. He smiled, said thanks, and returned to his chart. But the compliment hit him in a place he didn't realize had been empty. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't desire. It was validation. Simple, easy, undemanding validation. At home, conversations had started feeling heavy. Every question Tiana asked seemed layered with concern or frustration, though she never spoke with accusation. Nicholas just interpreted it that way because he was already running from his own guilt, so that one compliment, light as a feather, landed like relief. Later that same day, another coworker cracked a small joke while Nicholas was grabbing a file. Something harmless, something typical office humor. But Nicholas laughed more than the joke deserved. He didn't realize it at the time, but he was responding not to the joke itself, but to the feeling of being momentarily free from accountability. That's how escape begins, not with intention, with relief. Over the next week, tiny exchanges accumulated. Compliments about his work shirt, comments about how focused he looked, laughter that didn't carry emotional weight. Innocent things, harmless things, small interactions that required nothing from him. Nicholas didn't walk toward trouble. He drifted. He drifted because drifting feels safe when home feels tense. He drifted because he liked being seen without being questioned. He drifted because ease feels like comfort until you realize it's eroding something important. Nicholas was never the type to confront his emotions directly. He didn't examine why he felt disconnected from Tiana. He didn't reflect on why her quiet disappointment affected him. Instead, he avoided. He buried. He distracted. And distraction became a door. At home, Tiana would ask, "How was your day?" He'd shrug, long. At work, someone would say, "You handled that meeting well," and suddenly his chest felt a little lighter. It was never about the people at work. It was about the pressure he felt at home, pressure he created. Because when you withdraw from someone who loves you, their concern can feel like confrontation, even when it isn't. And instead of facing the truth, Nicholas leaned into whatever felt easier. One afternoon, he lingered in the hallway longer than necessary after finishing a discussion with a colleague. They'd been joking about a tedious project, and the joke wasn't even that funny, but Nicholas stayed there smiling, enjoying the moment, enjoying how uncomplicated it felt. When he returned to his desk, he caught himself thinking, "It feels good to laugh without thinking." The thought bothered him, not because he understood its meaning, but because a part of him knew it hinted at something deeper. Yet he didn't stop to unpack it. Nicholas didn't seek out emotional escape. He simply didn't shut the door on it. And that's how people slip, not through dramatic temptation, but through unnoticed cracks. Meanwhile, Tiana stayed the same steady, caring presence she'd always been. She still cooked when she had the energy. She still asked about his day. She still tried to create small moments where they could reconnect. But Nicholas interpreted her attempts as weight. Every gentle question felt like pressure. Every act of care felt like an expectation. Every moment of silence became a mirror he didn't want to look into. So he leaned further into ease, not a person, yet just the feeling of being unchallenged. This was the pattern forming. At home, emotional work. At work, escape. One afternoon, Nicholas caught himself lingering at his desk even after his tasks were done. He didn't want to sit in traffic, he told himself. He didn't want to deal with more emails, he claimed. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to sit across from Tiana knowing he couldn't hide his own avoidance. Men don't always run toward someone else. Sometimes they run from themselves. And Nicholas, untested, unpracticed in emotional responsibility, gravitated toward whatever let him ignore that reality. A harmless compliment, a joke, a moment of feeling seen without expectation. These were not the beginning of an affair. They were the beginning of the absence that made betrayal possible. Nicholas thought he was in control. He thought these tiny moments meant nothing. He thought he could enjoy the ease and return home unaffected. But distance grows quietly. Walls build themselves when you stop caring for the foundation, and connection fades in the very moments you assume it will survive anything. Nicholas wasn't choosing another woman. Not yet. He was choosing comfort over accountability, ease over effort, silence over truth. And without meaning to, without planning to, without even seeing it happen, he unlocked the door that pain would eventually walk through. Tiana didn't know any of this. Not yet. She only felt his absence deepening. Nicholas didn't see the danger. Not at all. This is how the story turned, not by one big moment, but by a series of tiny, careless choices that reshaped the path ahead. Trouble had not arrived, but the invitation had. So, withdrawal doesn't always look like leaving. Sometimes it looks like someone staying exactly where they've always been, just quieter, softer, smaller. That's what happened to Tiana. After months of feeling Nicholas slip away inch by inch, she reached a point where her heart simply stopped pushing. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just quietly. She didn't announce her exhaustion. She didn't slam doors. She didn't accuse him of anything. She didn't even bring up the cologne, the grooming habits, or the way he guarded his phone more than before. Instead, she pulled her energy inward. The first sign was her silence, not the kind born from anger, the kind born from protecting whatever strength she had left. When Nicholas came home late, she didn't ask why. When he brushed past her distractions with "I'm tired," she didn't press. When he gave vague answers, she accepted them without reminders. She stopped trying to hold together something she was carrying alone. Nicholas didn't notice the shift right away. He saw her silence as peace, not retreat. He thought her stillness meant things were finally calm between them, unaware that calmness can sometimes be surrender in disguise. Her friends noticed before he did. One evening, Tiana met up with two close friends at a small cafe near her place. They hadn't seen her in a few weeks and were expecting the lively version of her, the one with jokes and updates and warm stories. Instead, they got a quieter version. "You okay?" one of them asked gently. "I'm fine," Tiana replied with a small smile. But her eyes said something else. Not pain, distance. "You've barely talked about Nicholas," the other friend observed. "There's not much to talk about," she said softly. That sentence held more truth than she intended to reveal. Her friends exchanged a knowing glance, but didn't push her. People who love you can hear the heaviness between your words, even when you insist everything is normal. Later that night, when she got home, she found Nicholas lying on the couch scrolling through his phone. He glanced up briefly. Hey. That was it. No warmth. No follow-up question. No effort to bridge the gap. Tiana walked past him into the bedroom, took a slow breath, and realized she didn't even feel hurt in the way she once did. She felt tired, and tired hearts don't beg. They retreat. Her mother sensed the shift during a Sunday phone call. Mothers have a way of hearing what their children won't say. "How are you, baby?" her mother asked. "I'm all right," Tiana answered, keeping her tone even. "You sound quiet." "I'm just thinking a lot." "About what?" Tiana hesitated. Then she said, "Life." Her mother paused on the other end. "That man isn't making you question your worth, is he?" Tiana's breath caught, not because the question was harsh, but because it was accurate. "No," she answered softly. "I'm just trying to understand where we are right now." Her mother didn't respond right away. Then she said the thing Tiana needed, but didn't want to hear. "Baby, love shouldn't feel like guessing." That line stayed with Tiana for the next several nights. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She didn't even confront Nicholas. She simply observed. She observed how he no longer looked up from his laptop when she entered the room. She observed how his tone stayed flat, even when she tried to share small pieces of her day. She observed how their conversations became exchanges instead of connections. She observed how her needs felt like intrusions to him. And the more she observed, the deeper her withdrawal became. Not bitterness, not resentment, exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying emotional weight alone. The exhaustion of hoping someone will return to you without realizing they're already somewhere else. The exhaustion of choosing love daily while the other person chooses silence. Inside her mind, a quiet dialogue ran each night, the kind that doesn't come from insecurity but from clarity. Is this love? Or just history? Am I waiting for someone who has already left emotionally? When did I stop being his safe place? Why does care feel heavy now? She didn't voice these thoughts to Nicholas because she didn't want to force emotional labor from someone who could barely offer presence. She didn't want another dismissal. She didn't want another, "You're overthinking." So she kept her reflections inside. She stopped initiating conversations unless necessary. She stopped planning dinners or outings. She stopped reminding him about small moments they used to share. She stopped over-explaining her feelings. She became quiet enough for him to finally feel the absence he had created, but Nicholas didn't feel it yet. Not truly. He mistook her silence for stability. He thought the relationship had returned to a neutral place. He assumed she was no longer asking for connection because everything was fine. But nothing was fine. Silence just became easier than hurt. The illusion of everything is fine is the most dangerous phase of a failing relationship. Outsiders saw a functioning couple. Her friends saw a fading spark. Her mother saw truth forming in the distance. Tiana saw the gap widening every day. Nicholas saw none of it. Because when someone emotionally withdraws from a relationship, they often lose the ability to recognize when the other person is doing the same, just for different reasons. He kept drifting, unaware that Tiana was no longer waiting for him to notice. She wasn't planning to leave. She wasn't preparing for an ending. She wasn't plotting a confrontation. She was simply conserving what remained of her emotional strength. Because loving someone who won't meet you halfway doesn't just hurt, it empties you. And Tiana was nearing empty. Her withdrawal wasn't the cause of their downfall. It was a response to a decline that Nicholas had started long before. By the time the blonde woman eventually entered the picture, the real damage had already been done. In moments like these, where Tiana gave less and less of her voice because Nicholas had given less and less of his presence. That was the truth she lived with quietly. And yet Nicholas never asked why. It happened on a Wednesday, the middle of the week, the middle of the month, the middle of a relationship that was no longer standing the way it used to. Nicholas walked into the kitchen that morning already dressed, hair neatly styled, the new cologne clinging to him with a sharp, clean scent that didn't match anything in their home. Tiana was making tea, moving through the kitchen with slow, quiet motions she'd grown accustomed to over the last several months. "Morning," he said, grabbing a protein bar from the counter. "Morning," she replied, her tone soft but distant. He checked his watch, then slipped his phone into his pocket with the same protective gesture he'd been repeating for weeks. "I won't be home for dinner tonight. There's a work dinner I need to attend." Work dinner. The two words she learned to fear without showing it. Tiana nodded carefully, holding her mug between both hands. "Okay. What time will you be back?" "I don't know." "Late." She only said, "All right," and that was it. No questions, no expectations, no tension. Her silence wasn't permission. It was reality. Nicholas kissed her cheek, quick, distracted, barely touching her skin, then left the apartment with the faint sound of keys and hurried footsteps. The door closed. The quiet returned. Tiana stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the spot where Nicholas had just been standing. Something lingered there, not grief, not anger, just a settling truth. She didn't know exactly what was happening with him. She didn't know where he was emotionally or who he was trying to be, but she knew one thing clearly. She wasn't part of his world anymore. At least not the part he chose to show energy to. The day moved slowly. Tiana worked, cleaned, reorganized a few things in the living room, cooked a small dinner, and sat at the table by herself. The food grew cold. She didn't mind. She wasn't really hungry. This wasn't the kind of hunger food solved. As the sky darkened, she tried to distract herself with a show, then switched it off. She tried calling a friend, but hung up before the first ring. Not because she didn't want to talk, but because she didn't want to explain something she still couldn't fully describe. It wasn't heartbreak. It wasn't betrayal. It was loneliness wrapped in acceptance. A loneliness that felt like a thick blanket she couldn't take off no matter how much she wanted to breathe. By 9:30, Nicholas still hadn't texted. By 10, she stopped glancing at the clock. By 11, she sat on the couch with her knees pulled close, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. Not a single message from him, and she didn't send one either. She was done chasing someone who wouldn't stand still long enough to face her. At a little after midnight, the door finally opened. Nicholas walked in smelling like wine and something floral, soft, sweet, unfamiliar. Not her perfume, not anything she kept in the apartment. Tiana didn't move from the couch. She watched him quietly, her face unreadable. He froze when he realized she was awake. "Oh, hey, I didn't think you'd still be up. I couldn't sleep," she replied. "Dinner ran long," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "A client wanted to go over some stuff." His voice was steady, but his eyes were everywhere except on her. He avoided her gaze the way people do when they're afraid of what they'll see reflected back. Tiana's tone stayed calm. "What was the dinner about?" He swallowed lightly. "Just work. You know how it gets. Work. Always work." She nodded slowly. "I see." Nicholas moved toward the bedroom, loosening his collar, clearly eager to escape the weight of the moment. Tiana stayed seated. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't ask who had been there, or why his shirt smelled like warmth she didn't recognize. But as he walked past her, she inhaled, the perfume hitting her senses sharply. It clung to him too closely to be a casual encounter, too deeply to be accidental, too freshly to be ignored. She didn't speak on it. She just sat with it, the truth settling into her like a slow ache that didn't need confirmation. Nicholas paused at the bedroom door, rubbing the back of his neck. "T, I'm exhausted. Can we talk tomorrow?" The irony wasn't lost on her. Tomorrow had become the place he stored every conversation he didn't want to face today. She nodded once. "Good night, Nicholas." He hesitated, just for a moment, then whispered, "Good night," before closing the bedroom door gently behind him. The soft latch of that door felt heavier than any argument they could have had. Tiana stayed on the couch long after Nicholas disappeared inside the bedroom. The apartment felt different, not cold, empty. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the small light over the stove, and leaned her hands against the counter. Her breath came slowly, evenly, like she was trying to hold herself steady in a room that no longer felt like home. For the first time, she let her truth surface without trying to calm it or rationalize it. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not because she didn't know this was coming, but because she had finally accepted that Nicholas wasn't lost. He had drifted, and he wasn't reaching back. She pressed her palms flat against the counter, grounding herself. "This is happening," she whispered. Not a dramatic moment, not a breakdown, just a woman standing in her own kitchen, facing the reality she'd been trying to protect herself from for months. There was no yelling, no confrontation, no storm, just truth. And truth, when it finally settles, is heavier than any heartbreak. That night didn't reveal another woman's name. It didn't expose betrayal in a loud, undeniable way. It didn't involve phone records or secrets falling out of someone's pocket. It revealed something far more painful. Nicholas was no longer hers emotionally, and she was finally strong enough to see it. The perfume was just confirmation, but the real betrayal had happened long before midnight. It happened each time he drifted instead of choosing her. Each time he dismissed her concern. Each time he withheld more of himself. Each time she waited for a version of him he no longer offered. This was the night the truth stopped whispering. It spoke, and Tiana, she finally listened. Sunday mornings used to be their slowest time. A shared routine built on quiet comfort, warm breakfast, soft music, sunlight creeping across the floor, and the easy rhythm of two people simply being near each other. But this particular Sunday arrived differently. The sun rose, but the warmth didn't enter the apartment. The air felt still, almost hesitant, the way a room feels when it knows the people inside it are no longer moving in harmony. Tiana woke alone. Nicholas wasn't beside her, wasn't in the bathroom, wasn't making coffee like he used to months ago. She found him in the kitchen instead, already dressed in a clean button-up shirt and pressed slacks, his hair styled with more intention than a typical errand run would ever require. He didn't see her at first. His back was to the doorway as he adjusted the cuffs on his shirt, glancing at his phone between movements. His posture was stiff, not work-stress stiff, but guilt-stiff. "Tea," he said when he finally noticed her standing there. "Morning." She offered a gentle nod. "Morning." He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "I have to step out for a bit. Something came up. A work thing. On a Sunday? She asked softly. No accusation, just observation. Nicholas cleared his throat, fiddling with the last button. It happens sometimes. Clients, you know, they have strange schedules. He couldn't hold her gaze for more than a second. That told her more than any explanation he could have given. Tiana leaned against the doorway, one arm wrapped gently around her waist. She didn't interrogate him. She didn't have the energy anymore. She simply watched him with the quiet clarity of someone who had spent months studying every small change. Okay, she said, do what you need to do. Her calmness unsettled him. He expected frustration, expected questions, expected some reaction that would let him feel justified in pulling away. But she gave him nothing to push against. Nicholas grabbed his keys and wallet, then reached for his phone, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket instead of leaving it on the counter like he used to. He paused at the door. I'll be back later. Have a good day, she replied. 3 simple words. 3 quiet syllables. And yet something in them made Nicholas hesitate. Not because they were harsh, because they were hollow, offering no invitation, no expectation, no emotional room for him to rest in. He nodded once, then walked out, closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed louder than the click itself. Tiana stood in the empty kitchen for several minutes. Not frozen, not devastated, just still. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room. The breakfast bowls from yesterday, the folded dish towel beside the sink, the half-finished grocery list on the counter. All these tiny traces of a life they shared once, a life that felt further away with each passing week. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. For a moment, she stared at her own hands, resting lightly against the cool surface. There was no dramatic thought running through her mind, just a steady, quiet truth. This isn't love anymore, not because affection had vanished, but because connection had. She cleaned the apartment out of habit, sweeping, wiping counters, rearranging a few things in the living room. She didn't rush. She simply moved the way someone moves when they're trying to keep their mind from drifting toward the ache sitting under their ribs. Hours passed. Not once did her phone buzz. Not once did Nicholas text. Not once did he check in. It wasn't the absence of the message that hurt. It was the certainty behind it. He wasn't thinking about her. By late afternoon, she sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor. Then her phone lit up. A short, almost careless message appeared on the screen. Won't be home for dinner, at an event. No explanation, no detail, no warmth, just an update, the kind you give to someone who is no longer part of the deeper parts of your life. Tiana read the message twice, then placed the phone beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't call him. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she rose slowly and walked toward the bedroom. In the quiet of that room, she opened her closet. Her fingers brushed lightly across dresses she hadn't worn in months, not because she didn't want to look beautiful, but because her heart hadn't felt seen in so long she forgot what it felt like to step into a moment with intention. But today was different. Something in her spirit, a quiet strength she inherited from generations of women who refused to shrink for anyone, awakened. She reached for a simple black dress, elegant, fitted, uncomplicated. She held it up against herself in the mirror and breathed in slowly. This wasn't about seduction. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about Nicholas. It was about reclaiming the version of herself she had set aside, the one who knew her worth long before silence tried to convince her otherwise. She placed gold earrings on the dresser, the ones her grandmother had given her. They made her feel grounded, connected to something bigger than heartache. Her makeup was minimal, soft touches that enhanced her expression without masking it. And through all of it, she didn't say a word, not to herself, not to the room, not to the memory of the man she loved. Silence became her armor. Before leaving the apartment, she paused by the door, keys in hand. This wasn't a chase. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a woman trying to catch a man in a lie. This was a woman choosing truth over comfort, choosing to see reality instead of waiting for it to arrive on its own. She locked the door behind her, stepped into the hallway, and walked toward the elevator with a steady grace, the kind that makes even walls want to step aside. The final straw wasn't the message. It wasn't the perfume the night before. It wasn't the months of withdrawal. The final straw was simple. Tiana was done hoping Nicholas would return to a relationship he had already abandoned in pieces. Tonight, she would look truth in the face herself, and whatever she found, she would face it standing tall. The sky over uptown Charlotte had shifted into deep evening by the time Tiana stepped out of the rideshare. The buildings glowed with warm amber light, glass reflections shimmering like they were holding every secret the city had ever witnessed. She stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the kind of place Nicholas always described with pride. Warm, soft lighting, glass walls that let strangers look in but never all the way through, white tablecloths, wine lists longer than most conversations, a room full of people who dressed like their lives always made sense. Tiana paused before entering, not because she was unsure, because she was steadying herself, grounding her posture, her breath, her purpose. She wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here to embarrass anyone. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to stop lying to herself. Inside, the restaurant hummed with polished conversations, the soft clink of glasses, occasional laughter swelling and fading, waiters gliding between tables with quiet precision. Tiana stepped through the doors. The air shifted immediately, not because she made a scene, but because grace carries a presence people can feel, even when they don't know why. She walked toward the hostess stand. The hostess looked her up and down, not judgmental, just slightly confused, the way someone looks at a person who clearly belongs in the room even if they weren't expected. "Good evening," the hostess said with a polite smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "I'm meeting someone," Tiana replied gently. "Of course." "Name?" She didn't offer one. Instead, she let her eyes move past the hostess into the main dining area, slowly, carefully, with the quiet confidence of someone who refuses to shrink even when her heart is fragile. And then she saw him, Nicholas, standing at a table near the center of the room, a drink in his hand, posture comfortable, tie loosened just enough to look relaxed. He wasn't alone. He was angled toward a woman seated at the table, blonde hair, fitted dress, a practiced smile, the kind of elegance that photographs well in places like this. But it wasn't the blonde hair that struck Tiana. It wasn't her looks or her dress or her presence. It was the man beside her. Nicholas was laughing, a familiar laugh, one she recognized instantly because it was once hers. That laugh had once been shared in cramped offices, on casual nights in their apartment, on early morning drives to nowhere in particular. She hadn't heard that version of him in months, and now he was offering it freely to someone else. The world didn't slow down. Tiana did. Her breath steadied. Her shoulders relaxed. Her spine aligned. Her heart, despite everything, beat in a calm, even rhythm. This wasn't shock. This wasn't disbelief. This was confirmation. The hostess followed her gaze and her expression subtly shifted, recognition, then the quiet understanding of what was unfolding. She stepped aside instinctively, as if letting truth pass through unobstructed. Tiana's heels clicked on the polished floor as she walked deeper into the room. Her movement was slow, unhurried, almost serene, the kind of walk that turns attention without force. The nearby tables fell quieter, not because people were nosy, but because authenticity commands silence. Someone whispered, "Is that?" Another murmured, "Oh, wow." Even the waiters paused their steps for a second, sensing the tension tightening the air like a held breath. Nicholas didn't see her at first. The blonde woman said something that made him smile, really smile, and he leaned slightly closer as if her presence required full attention. Tiana continued forward. Halfway across the room, she stopped briefly, not out of hesitation but out of grounding, placing herself firmly in the present moment. She wasn't imagining anything. She wasn't overreacting. She wasn't breaking. She was choosing herself. When she stepped forward again, the room seemed to follow the motion, as if every gaze shifted toward her in quiet anticipation. The blonde woman noticed her first. Her expression faltered, not guilt, not fear, just confusion, then a flicker of realization as she looked at Nicholas's reaction. Because Nicholas finally turned, and the moment he saw Tiana, his entire body changed. His shoulders dropped. His face lost its color. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by something between panic and regret. His hand tightened on the glass. His breath caught. It wasn't the reaction of a man caught cheating. It was the reaction of a man caught abandoning someone who loved him. The blonde straightened in her chair, sensing a shift she hadn't prepared for. Nicholas stepped backward slightly, as if distance could soften the blow of her presence. "TT," he stammered, voice trembling. The restaurant went silent, not theatrical silence, but human silence, the kind that comes when strangers sense truth cracking open right in front of them. Tiana didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't look at anyone else. She kept her eyes on Nicholas, calm, steady, heartbreakingly soft. And then she walked the remaining distance to the table. Every step carried dignity. Every movement carried restraint. Every breath carried the weight of months of trying. People weren't staring because drama had arrived. They were staring because grace had. Nicholas looked like a child caught lying for the first time. Not angry, not defensive, just lost. "Tiana, what are you doing here?" he asked, voice cracking. His question wasn't real curiosity. It was fear wrapped in confusion, the fear of a man who finally realized the consequences of small choices. "I'm here," she said quietly, "because the truth doesn't hide forever." The blonde woman swallowed hard, not moving, her face paling as she processed the dynamic between them. A man at a nearby table whispered, "This is not going to end the way he thinks." The room felt like a still photograph, not frozen but breathless. And in that stillness, Tiana stood tall, unflinching, unbroken, finally done waiting for a man who already left her long before this moment. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't spectacle. This wasn't performance. This was closure walking in on its own 2 feet. The next part, the confrontation, would define Nicholas's unraveling and Tiana's rise. But in this moment, in the middle of that restaurant, surrounded by strangers and truth, Tiana didn't collapse. She didn't bend. She didn't shrink. She stood up straight, and the room mirrored her. Nicholas stood frozen, the kind of stillness that happens when a person realizes their choices have finally outrun their excuses. His eyes darted around the room before returning to Tiana, as if hoping the moment wasn't real, as if wishing he could rewind just 30 minutes and undo everything. But life doesn't rewind. Life reveals. "Tiana," he whispered, voice barely holding its shape. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't rush him. She simply stood there, her posture calm, her breathing steady, her expression heartbreakingly composed. Grace has a weight to it, and tonight it settled on her shoulders like armor. Nicholas swallowed hard, panic rising under his skin. "I can explain." Her head tilted slightly, not unkindly, just unconvinced. "Explain what, Nicholas?" she asked softly. "That you're here, or that you haven't been with me in months?" The blonde woman lowered her gaze, her fingers drifting away from the wineglass she'd been holding. It was no longer a social evening to her. It was exposure. But the exposure wasn't hers. Nicholas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man trying to gather words that didn't exist. Tiana stepped closer, not aggressively, not emotionally, just enough to stand level with the table. Her voice stayed low, controlled, painful in its honesty. "I didn't come here to argue," she said. "I didn't come here to embarrass you." Nicholas's throat tightened. Then, "Why?" Her answer was immediate, quiet, sharp in its clarity. "I came to see the man you've become." The restaurant didn't move. Someone at a table near the window let out a breath they'd been holding. The blonde woman's eyes widened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. Nicholas looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "T, please, can we talk somewhere else?" "Not like this." She shook her head gently. "Why not like this? You made room for everything else in public, except accountability." Nicholas winced, physically winced, because he knew she was right. Tiana's tone didn't rise. It didn't crack. It didn't plead. It simply existed in truth. "For months," she continued, "I waited for you to show up, not with gifts, not with gestures, with honesty." He took a shaky breath. "Tiana, I messed up. She raised her hand gently, not to silence him, to steady herself. "You didn't lose me because you were busy," she said quietly. "You lost me because you let yourself become someone small." A soft gasp moved through the room, not dramatic, human, because everyone understood what that sentence meant. Everyone had either loved someone who shrank themselves or had been the one who did the shrinking. Nicholas blinked rapidly, tears threatening. He stepped forward slightly, reaching out instinctively, but Tiana stepped back. He froze mid-reach. Her voice softened even more. "You stopped choosing us, Nicholas. You stopped choosing the truth. You stopped choosing the version of yourself that could actually love deeply." He wiped his face quickly, ashamed. "T, I didn't mean to hurt you." She nodded. "I know. But hurt doesn't need intention to exist." The blonde shifted in her seat, guilt settling over her like a shadow she didn't expect to be cast in. She wasn't the villain. She was the revelation, and revelations are rarely comfortable. Tiana glanced at her briefly, then back at Nicholas. "This isn't about her," she said, and the woman exhaled in something like relief mixed with regret. "This is about you, about who you allowed yourself to become when things required effort instead of ease." Nicholas covered his mouth with his hand, trying to hold himself together. He looked utterly undone, not in anger, not in bluster, but in the quiet collapse of a man who finally understands the gravity of what he has broken. "Tiana," he whispered, voice trembling, "I can fix this. Please, let's go home. Let's talk. I'll do better." She stared at him for a long, heavy moment. It wasn't hesitation. It was mourning the man she once believed he could have been. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked just slightly. Not from weakness, from truth rising to the surface. "I'm not leaving with you, Nicholas." His face crumpled. "I loved you," she continued, "but I won't love you smaller than the woman I'm becoming." A murmur moved through the room again. Not gossip, but empathy. People weren't watching spectacle. They were watching strength. Nicholas reached for her again. Slow, tentative, desperate. But she stepped back once more, keeping the same distance she had maintained with her heart for months. He broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically. His shoulders sank. His head lowered. The truth settled over him like a weight he could no longer deny. The blonde woman looked down at her hands, overwhelmed. She wasn't smug. She wasn't victorious. She looked like someone who had just witnessed the cost of emotional negligence, the kind that leaves no one truly winning. Tiana inhaled deeply, steadying herself, gathering the last of her strength for the final step. "I hope you find the version of yourself that doesn't run from the people who love you," she said gently. Then she turned, not abruptly, not angrily, not with theatrics. She turned with the quiet dignity of a woman who had finally reached the end of her suffering. And as she walked toward the exit, the restaurant parted around her. Not out of pity, not out of shock, out of respect. Nicholas didn't follow her. He couldn't. His legs wouldn't move. His voice wouldn't form words. His shame held him in place like gravity. The blonde woman watched him silently, realizing in real time that she wasn't standing beside a man who had left someone. She was standing beside a man who had lost someone. When Tiana stepped outside, the night air embraced her, cool, steady, real. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to cry, but to breathe. For the first time in a long time, the breath didn't hurt. If you've ever walked away quietly because your dignity finally spoke louder than your fear, go ahead and like the video so it reaches someone who needs this reminder. When Tiana walked out of the restaurant, the door didn't slam. It didn't need to. Silence can end things more thoroughly than any sound. Nicholas stood there long after she disappeared beyond the glass walls, still staring at the place where she had stood moments earlier. His hands shook slightly, not from fear of exposure, but from a deep internal collapse he had spent years outrunning. The blonde woman shifted in her chair, her eyes lowered. She finally whispered, "Maybe you should go after her." Nicholas didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His throat had closed around a truth he'd never been forced to swallow. He had done this. He had built the distance. He had ignored the warnings. He had let ease replace effort. He had invited silence inside his home, and then wondered why love stopped speaking. When he finally left the restaurant, he didn't call a ride immediately. He walked, not with direction, with heaviness. The streets of uptown Charlotte felt different at night. Normally he liked the buzz of weekend traffic, the glow of lights on the pavement, the soft murmur of people heading toward evening plans. But tonight, everything sounded far away, blurred by the weight inside his chest. He reached a bench near the corner of the block and sat down. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. His breathing grew shallow. For the first time in his life, he wasn't protected by privilege, charm, or indifference. He wasn't insulated by parents who always defended him. He wasn't surrounded by colleagues who laughed at every half-hearted joke. For the first time, he was alone with himself, truly alone, and it terrified him. He replayed Tiana's words over and over. "You didn't lose me to her. You lost me because you let yourself become someone small." He closed his eyes tightly as if squeezing them shut would push the memory away. But it didn't. The scene kept looping, her voice steady, her eyes calm, her strength unmistakable. Nicholas had always assumed that love, once given, stayed. That good women stayed. That forgiveness stayed. That patience stayed. He had never experienced consequences that couldn't be negotiated. He'd been raised in a world where mistakes were smoothed over with gentle conversations or polite explanations. A world where discomfort was avoided and emotional truth was treated like an inconvenience. But Tiana didn't operate in that world. She came from a place where love meant showing up, not just in the beginning, not just when convenient, but consistently. Nicholas realized, sitting alone on that bench, that he never internalized that kind of responsibility. He wanted connection without accountability, affection without discomfort, love without growth. And it cost him everything that mattered. When he finally returned home, the apartment felt foreign. The lights were off, except for a small lamp in the living room. Tiana's things were still there. Her jacket draped over the back of a chair, her shoes neatly placed near the door, a book left open on the coffee table. But the emotional presence she carried with her was gone. Nicholas walked further inside, hesitating in the doorway of the bedroom. Her pillow still carried the light imprint of her head. The bedspread was slightly rumpled, touched by her hands before she dressed and walked out hours earlier. The quiet of the apartment pressed against him. He sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed his emotions to rise. Tears escaped, not dramatic sobs, just quiet, steady drops rolling down his face. He whispered her name once, Tiana. But names don't summon people back. He put his face in his hands and allowed the truth to land without shelter. He had taken her for granted. He had taken love for granted. He had assumed that because she loved him deeply, she would endure anything. He believed her strength meant she would always wait. But strength doesn't mean endless tolerance. Sometimes strength means leaving quietly. Nicholas got up and walked to the bathroom. He stared at himself in the mirror, truly stared, for the first time in years. His reflection looked unfamiliar, not because of the suit, not because of the exhaustion, because he saw the man Tiana had seen long before he realized it, a man who refused to grow, a man who chose ease over honesty, a man who let his partner carry emotional weight he was never willing to lift, a man who kept drifting because he believed being loved was enough to stay lovable. He gripped the sink tightly. For years, he had dodged accountability by convincing himself he wasn't doing anything that bad. Late nights, emotional withdrawal, vague explanations. None of it seemed harmful to him because he had never been forced to confront the consequences of small betrayals. Tonight was the first time he understood. Small betrayals still break hearts. He remembered the moment Tiana stepped backward when he reached for her in the restaurant. The message behind that movement hit him now with crushing clarity. She wasn't protecting herself from him. She was protecting her growth from his stagnation. For the first time, he asked himself the question he had avoided all year. Why didn't I fight for us? Not fight loudly. Fight maturely, through presence, effort, honesty. He knew the answer. Because fighting for love requires vulnerability. And vulnerability was something he had never learned to sit inside. But now vulnerability sat inside him, uninvited, unavoidable, and necessary. Nicholas sank to the floor back against the wall, legs stretched out, eyes distant. He couldn't fix this with flowers. He couldn't fix this with apologies he didn't understand. He couldn't fix this with charm or promises. The only way forward was through accountability, the very thing he had avoided his entire life. Tonight was the first time he realized something painful and transformative. Consequences aren't cruel. They're clarifying. And for the first time in his life, he was finally going to learn what accountability felt like, not as punishment, but as growth. Tiana didn't go home after leaving the restaurant. Her spirit was too charged, too full, too raw to return to the silence of the apartment she once shared with Nicholas. Instead, she walked, slow, deliberate steps through the night air of Charlotte, letting each breath steady her. She wasn't running away. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't spiraling. She was decompressing after months of carrying emotional weight for two. Eventually, she headed to her mother's house on the south side, the place where she always found grounding, where the world felt less complicated and more honest. Her mother opened the door even before she knocked, as if she had been waiting. "Mama," Tiana whispered, her voice catching. Her mother said nothing at first. She simply pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her like she did when Tiana was a child, firm, warm, unshakable. The kind of embrace that reminds a person that they were loved long before they ever entered a relationship. Inside, the living room smelled like vanilla and the faint remnants of dinner. Gospel music played softly from a speaker in the corner, comforting, steady, familiar. Her mother guided her to the couch. "Sit, baby. Tell me what's weighing you down." Tiana took a long breath, looking at her own hands for a moment before speaking. Mama, he wasn't just gone. He was elsewhere. And tonight, everything I already knew finally showed itself." Her mother nodded slowly. "Sometimes truth waits until we're strong enough to see it." Tiana leaned back, letting her shoulders relax for the first time in months. "I kept hoping it was just stress, that he'd come back to me if I was patient, that love just goes through quiet seasons." She shook her head softly. "But I was wrong. I wasn't in a quiet season. I was alone." Her mother reached over and gently cupped her hand. "You didn't lose him. He lost a woman who loved him fully, and losing a woman like you, that's a wound he's going to live with for a long time." A tear slipped down Tiana's cheek, not grief, not despair, but release. "I'm tired, Mama," she whispered. "I'm so tired of carrying everything." "You don't have to carry anything tonight," her mother replied. "Rest. Let your spirit breathe again." The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room where Tiana had slept. She woke slowly, not with dread, not with panic, but with a quiet clarity. She sat up, stretching, feeling the first flicker of lightness she had felt in months. Her phone sat on the nightstand. Several missed calls from Nicholas, a few messages, none of them opened. She didn't feel guilty about ignoring them. She felt in control. After showering, she walked into the kitchen where her mother was preparing breakfast. The scent of eggs, turkey bacon, and toast warmed the air. Her mother looked up with a tender smile. "You look lighter." "I feel lighter," Tiana said honestly. "Not healed, but lighter." "Good. Healing isn't a moment. It's a direction." They ate together, laughing occasionally at old stories, at memories that reminded Tiana of who she was before love stretched her thin. After breakfast, her younger cousins stopped by. They didn't know the details. They didn't need to. They just hugged her like she mattered. Their energy, loud and chaotic, filled the room with warmth. One cousin joked, "Come on, T, you still got it. Don't let some man with weak communication skills ruin your shine." Everyone laughed, including Tiana. A real laugh. One that stretched her lungs and loosened the tension she'd been holding inside. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen for something other than her patience. Over the next few days, she re-entered her community in ways she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She walked the familiar streets of her neighborhood, passing barbershops, corner stores, local restaurants where people knew her name. She visited her favorite coffee spot, where the owner always complimented her creativity. "Where you been hiding, Tiana?" he asked, with a smile. She smiled back. "Finding myself again." She allowed herself to reconnect with her work, throwing her energy into branding projects that once sparked her passion. Her ideas flowed more freely, her confidence returned, and her natural creativity, the thing Nicholas once admired, resurfaced without hesitation. Evenings were spent with friends, surrounded by laughter, honesty, and comfort food. They teased her, encouraged her, reminded her that heartbreak did not define her. Her mother offered quiet wisdom whenever Tiana needed grounding. "Love isn't supposed to drain your spirit. Strength isn't staying. Strength is knowing when to walk away. You're not rebuilding yourself, you're remembering yourself." Those words stuck with Tiana, settling into her heart like steady anchors. One night, after everyone else was asleep, she stepped outside onto her mother's porch. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing, crickets singing, a few cars humming in the distance. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked up at the sky. The ache was still there, soft, tender, but no longer suffocating. She spoke aloud, not to Nicholas, not to anyone in particular, but to herself. "I deserve someone who doesn't flinch at effort." It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't anger. It was truth, clean and simple. She breathed in deeply and released a long exhale. Her heart wasn't broken. Her heart was recovering, growing back into its full size now that she was no longer shrinking to fit into someone else's neglect. The woman she was becoming wasn't fueled by loss. She was fueled by rediscovery, by community, by truth, by self-worth returning to its rightful place, by the realization that love is not meant to be endured. It's meant to be shared. And she wasn't done sharing love. She was just done settling for someone who didn't know how to carry it. Tomorrow, life would move forward. Tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be, grounded, held, rediscovering herself piece by piece. And Nicholas, well, His consequences were only beginning. But Tiana? Tiana was rising. Some stories end loudly, with shouting, broken plates, slammed doors, and twisted emotions scattered across the floor. But most real stories, the ones that stay with us long after the moment passes, end the way this one did. Quietly, truthfully, without theatrics, without villains. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a truth that neither of them confronted soon enough. When we step back and look at everything that happened between Nicholas and Tiana, it's easy to point to the restaurant confrontation as the breaking point. But that moment wasn't the downfall. It was the confirmation. The downfall happened in dozens of small decisions, the kind of decisions human beings make without realizing the cost until much later. Nicholas never woke up one day and decided to lose her. He lost her gradually, through avoidance instead of honesty, through silence instead of presence, through ease instead of effort, through the belief that love stays regardless of how you treat it. Tiana didn't walk away because she stopped loving him. She walked away because she stopped leaving herself behind in order to love him. That distinction matters. A lot of people confuse endurance with commitment. They stay in situations that shrink them because they think leaving means failure. But sometimes leaving is the most honest expression of self-respect a person can give themselves. And that's what this story is really about. Not betrayal, not revenge, not punishment. It's about clarity. The clarity that arrives when someone finally accepts that the person they love isn't showing up for them anymore. Not fully, not consistently, not with the care that real love requires. Nicholas's journey doesn't end at heartbreak. His journey ends at accountability, real accountability, the kind he'd avoided since childhood, the kind that doesn't come wrapped in apologies or promises, the kind that requires a person to sit with their mistakes long enough to understand how they built them. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't intentionally destructive. He was unexamined. He floated through life without checking the weight of his choices, without asking how his silence shaped someone else's reality. And life finally handed him a truth he couldn't charm or excuse his way out of. Carelessness can break a heart just as deeply as betrayal. For the first time, he had to face the version of himself he'd become, not the polished, educated, well-raised man from the outside, but the emotionally avoidant man who thought affection was enough to sustain a relationship. He learned, painfully slowly, that affection is not love. Love is responsibility. Love is consistency. Love is honesty. Love is effort. Without those things, affection is just a comfortable illusion. Tiana, on the other hand, didn't rise because she wanted to prove anything. She rose because healing is what happens when truth finally stops hiding. She found laughter again, the real kind, the kind that doesn't have to fight through disappointment to make its way out. She leaned on her community, her mother's wisdom, her work, and her own resilience. She rediscovered the parts of herself that had taken a back seat while she waited for Nicholas to show up. And as she rebuilt her emotional center, something remarkable happened. She stopped thinking of herself as someone who had been left. She started seeing herself as someone who had been liberated. Liberated from uncertainty. Liberated from shrinking herself. Liberated from carrying more weight than one heart should carry. Her ending wasn't a triumph over Nicholas. It was a return to herself. And that is one of the quietest, most powerful victories a person can experience. Now, here is the lesson this story wants to leave with you. The lesson that sits beneath every moment they lived. Love doesn't fail because people change. Love fails because someone stops showing up. Showing up isn't just being physically present. It's being emotionally available. It's being honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. It's recognizing when your partner is hurting and choosing not to look away. It's listening without defensiveness. It's showing effort without waiting to be begged. It's choosing the relationship even on days when it feels easier to drift. Most people don't lose the love of their life because they fell out of love. They lose them because they stopped participating. And when you stop participating, someone else has to carry both halves, their half and yours. That weight becomes too heavy for anyone to hold for long. Tiana learned that lesson. Nicholas learned it too, but the price was far higher for him, because regret always costs more than effort. Before we close, let me speak directly to the viewers, not as a storyteller, but as someone who has lived long enough to understand how fragile and beautiful relationships really are. If you love someone, show up. Not just in the beginning, not just when it's convenient, always. If you notice your partner carrying more than their share, step in. If you feel yourself drifting, say something before silence makes the decisions for you. If you're choosing ease over growth, ask yourself why. Love doesn't survive on intention. It survives on action. And if you're someone who has walked away like Tiana did, quietly, with grace, with the last pieces of your dignity in your hands, I want you to know this. You did the brave thing. You did the necessary thing. And your heart will thank you for it years from now. Thank you for watching this story, for letting it breathe, for letting it speak truth, for allowing yourself to feel the parts that reminded you of real life and real choices. If you know someone who needs this message, someone who's losing themselves trying to keep a relationship alive alone, share this video with them. You might be giving them the clarity they've been struggling to find. And before you go, leave a comment about the moment in the story that hit you the hardest. Your comment might help someone else feel understood. Thank you for being here. Thank you for learning through this story. And thank you for caring about what love should really look like.